In the shadow of Mount Olympus, where gods once walked with men, a prince was born whose name would echo forever. Alexander came into the world during a great storm. Lightning split the sky on the night of his birth. The old women who helped with births said this was a sign. They whispered that this child would one day shake the world. Philip, king of Macedonia, watched his son grow with pride and worry. The boy was not like other children. At age 7, Alexander tamed a horse no man could ride. The great black stallion, Bucephalus, reared and kicked when men came near. But young Alexander saw what others missed. The horse was afraid of its own shadow. "Let me try," the boy said to his father. The men laughed. How could a child do what warriors could not? But Philip nodded, curious what his son would do. Alexander turned the horse to face the sun, so its shadow fell behind it. Then he spoke soft, words into its ear, and stroked its neck. The wild horse grew calm. With one smooth motion, Alexander jumped onto its back. Bucephalus, terror of the stables, carried the boy around the field as gentle as a lamb. "My son," King Philip said with tears in his eyes, "Macedonia is too small for you. You must find a kingdom worthy of your spirit." As Alexander grew, he learned from the wisest men. Aristotle himself taught the prince about the stars, the ways of animals, the history of heroes, and the art of ruling. Alexander slept with a knife, and Homer's stories under his pillow. By day he trained with sword and spear. By night he read of Achilles and dreamed of glory. "A true king," Aristotle told him, "rules not just bodies, but souls." Alexander nodded, his strange eyes gleaming. One eye was blue like the sea, the other dark as amber. Some said this showed his split nature, part god, part man, part scholar, part warrior. When Alexander was 16, Philip went to war. He left his son to rule Macedonia while he was gone. Rebels attacked from the north. Without waiting for his father's return, Alexander gathered soldiers and crushed the rebellion. When Philip came home, he found his borders safe, and his son, changed. No longer a boy, but a leader of men. "You have your mother's fire," Philip told him, "and something else I cannot name." 4 years later, as Philip celebrated his new marriage, a man with a hidden knife rushed toward the king. The blade flashed in the sun. Philip fell, his life's blood soaking into the dust. Some whispered that Alexander's mother Olympias had planned the murder, angry that Philip had taken a new wife. Others said Alexander himself knew of the plot. The truth died with Philip in the dust. At 20 years old, Alexander stood over his father's body and picked up the crown of Macedonia. The neighboring lands thought the time was right to attack. Surely this young king would be weak. Greece, which Philip had only just brought under control, began to rebel. "They say you are too young to rule," said old Antipater, who had served Philip for many years. Alexander smiled, but it was not a kind smile. It was the smile of a wolf before it bites. "Then we will teach them that greatness is not counted in years," he said. The city of Thebes was the first to rise against him. Its walls had stood for hundreds of years. Its people boasted that no army could take their city. Alexander marched his men there in just 13 days, a journey that should have taken twice as long. "Surrender," he called to the people on the walls, "and I will show mercy." The Thebans laughed and shouted insults. They did not believe this golden-haired boy could defeat them. 7 days later, Thebes burned. Its walls, which had stood for centuries, were broken stones. Its people who had laughed at Alexander were dead or sold as slaves. Only the house of the poet Pindar was left standing, for Alexander loved poetry even in his rage. The rest of Greece fell silent, watching in fear as smoke rose from what had been Thebes. No one dared to challenge the young king after that. Standing among the ruins, Alexander looked east toward the Persian Empire. The greatest power in the world ruled. By King Darius, who called himself King of Kings. The world waits for us, Alexander told his friends, his voice soft but filled with hunger. And we shall answer its call. His men raised their spears to the sky and shouted his name. The sound echoed off the broken walls of Thebes like thunder. The first step toward legend had been taken. The spear that would pierce the world was raised, ready to strike. The narrow sea called the Hellespont lay before Alexander and his army. On one side stood Europe, the land of his birth. On the other waited Asia, the land of his dreams. 35,000 men gathered behind their young king, their spears. Gleaming in the morning sun, Alexander stood at the water's edge. In his hand, he held a golden cup filled with wine. He poured it slowly into the waves. Poseidon, god of the sea, he prayed aloud. Grant us safe crossing to the lands that will soon be ours. Then he did something no one expected. He took his own spear, the one he carried in battle, and hurled it with all his might across the water. It flew through the air like a bird and stuck deep into the soil of Asia. The first conquest, he said, with a smile. Let us go claim my spear. The ships carried them across. When Alexander's foot touched Asian soil, he knelt and kissed the ground. His men thought this strange, but Alexander knew what he was doing. This was not just a war. This was destiny. Not far from the shore, the first Persian army waited. They stood guard at a river called Granicus. The Persian leaders laughed when they saw the small Macedonian army. This boy king comes to his death, they said. Alexander's. Old generals begged him to wait, to rest the men after their sea journey. But Alexander saw the sun glinting on the river and felt a fire in his blood. We attack now, he ordered. The river ran fast and deep. No sane commander would cross it to attack an army waiting on the other side. But Alexander was not always sane. He was first into the water, riding his black horse Bucephalus. His white plumes marked him for all to see. "The mad king leads them," shouted the Persian commander. "Kill him, and this war ends today." 7 Persian nobles rode to meet Alexander as he reached the far bank. Their curved swords flashed in the sun. Alexander's spear moved like lightning. One noble fell, then another. A sword cut Alexander's helmet in two, nearly taking his head. Blood ran down his face, but still he fought. Clytus, one of Alexander's men, saved his king's life that day. As a Persian raised his sword to strike Alexander from behind, Clytus drove his spear through the man's heart. By sunset, the river Granicus ran red with blood. The Persian army lay broken. Alexander had won his first battle on Asian soil. "This is just the beginning," he told his men as they bound their wounds that night. "Ahead lies the whole Persian Empire." City after city fell to Alexander as he marched deeper into Asia. Sardis, with its great treasures. Miletus, with its strong walls. Halicarnassus, home of the great tomb of Mausolus. Some fought. Some opened their gates without a fight. All became part of Alexander's growing empire. At a place called Gordium, Alexander faced not an army, but a puzzle. There stood an ancient wagon with its yoke tied in a knot so complex no one had ever untied it. An old saying promised that whoever undid the Gordian knot would rule all of Asia. People gathered to watch the young king try his hand at the famous knot. Alexander studied it for a long time. Then, to everyone's shock, he drew his sword and cut through the knot with a single stroke. "The gods care not how it is undone," he declared, "only that it is undone." Some laughed at this solution. Others nodded, seeing the wisdom. Alexander did not care what they thought. He had solved the puzzle in his own way, as he would conquer the world in his own way. In the ancient city of Troy, where the hero Achilles had fought long ago, Alexander made a special visit. He ran naked around the tomb of Achilles, his childhood hero, and took a sacred shield from the temple. "We fight not just for today," he told his men, but for the stories they will tell of us 1,000 years from now. Then came news that made Alexander's heart race. Darius himself, the great king of Persia, was marching to meet him with an army that darkened the horizon. They would meet at a place called Issus, where mountains touched the sea. When Alexander saw the vast Persian army, he did something that shocked his men. He laughed. It was not the laugh of fear or madness, but of pure joy. Today, he told his companions, we fight not for land or gold, but for glory that will outlive our bones. The battle that followed shook the earth. The Macedonian phalanx, 16 men deep with spears as tall as 3 men, moved like a single beast across the field. Alexander led his best horsemen in a charge aimed at the heart of the Persian army, at Darius himself. The great king of Persia, seeing the wild-eyed Macedonian cutting through his guards like a demon, felt fear for the first time in his life. Darius turned his golden chariot and fled, leaving behind his family, his treasure, and his honor. That night, Alexander entered the Persian king's tent. He sat on Darius's throne, used his bath, and slept in his bed. "How does it feel to be king of Asia?" asked Hephaestion, his closest friend. Alexander looked around at the Persian luxury and smiled. "It feels," he said, "like we have only just begun." After defeating Darius at Issus, Alexander marched his army south along the coast. Most cities opened their gates when they heard the Macedonian king was coming. They had heard stories of what happened to cities that fought him. But one city stood against him, Tyre. Tyre was built on an island half a mile from shore. Its walls rose straight from the sea. For hundreds of years, no enemy had ever taken Tyre by force. "No man can reach us here," the king of Tyre sent word to Alexander. "Not even you." Alexander studied the city from the shore. His men waited for his anger, but instead he smiled. "If there is no road to Tyre," he said, "then we shall build one." For 7 long months, Alexander's men worked to build a path through the sea. They dropped stones, trees, and earth into the water, creating a road to the island. The people of Tyre laughed at first. Then they grew worried. Then they grew afraid. They shot arrows at the workers. They sent burning ships to destroy the road. Nothing stopped Alexander. When the road finally reached the island, he brought up his great war machines. The walls of Tyre, which had never fallen, began to crack. When the city finally fell, Alexander's anger was terrible. Those who had mocked him from the walls now begged for mercy. They found none. Tyre burned, and many of its people were sold as slaves. "This is the price of standing against me," Alexander said as he watched the flames. From Tyre, Alexander marched to Egypt. The Egyptians hated their Persian rulers and welcomed the young king as a hero. The priests of the god Ammon led Alexander deep into the desert to a sacred place called Siwa. There they named him Son of Ammon, a living god. What happened in that desert temple, no one knows for sure. Alexander went in alone. When he came out, his face had changed. His eyes looked far away, as if seeing things others could not see. "What did the god tell you?" asked Ptolemy, one of his generals. "My destiny," Alexander replied, "and it is greater and more terrible than any man could bear to know." After Egypt, Alexander turned east again, hunting Darius. The Persian king had gathered a new army bigger than the last. They met on a wide plain called Gaugamela, near the ancient city of Babylon. The night before the battle, Alexander slept soundly while his generals worried. The Persian army was so vast, it seemed like the stars had fallen to earth and become campfires. "They are too many," whispered Ptolemy as they watched the enemy fires. "There are always too many," replied Alexander, calmly, "until they break." When morning came, the two armies faced each other across the plain. Darius had brought war elephants, chariots with sharp blades on their wheels, and archers whose arrows could blot out the sun. Alexander studied the field and saw something no one else noticed: a small gap in the Persian line. He ordered his men to move slowly toward the enemy, then suddenly turned and charged straight for that gap, leading his best horsemen. The battle was chaos and thunder. Dust rose so thick men could not see. Blood made the ground slick. Alexander fought his way toward Darius, his spear seeking the heart of the Persian Empire. Darius, seeing the Macedonian king coming for him again, made the same choice as before. He turned and fled. This time his army broke apart when they saw their king running. The greatest empire the world had ever known fell in a single day. Alexander rode into Babylon like a god. The oldest city in the world opened its gates to him. Its hanging gardens, its towers that reached for the sky, its wealth beyond counting, all now belonged to the young king from Macedonia. But Alexander did not stop. He pushed on to Persepolis, the heart of the Persian Empire. There stood the palace of Xerxes, the king who had invaded Greece 150 years before. Alexander held a great feast in the Persian palace. Wine flowed like water. In the middle of the night, either by accident or on purpose, fire broke out. The palace of Xerxes, one of the wonders of the world, burned to the ground. As he watched the flames, a shadow crossed Alexander's face. "What troubles you, my king?" asked Hephaestion, who knew Alexander's heart better than anyone. "I fear we destroy what we do not understand," Alexander answered softly, "and that in victory, something is lost that can never be found again." After Persepolis, Alexander began to change. He started to dress like a Persian king. He wore flowing robes instead of his Macedonian clothes. He asked men to bow before him, touching their heads to the ground as they had done for Darius. His old Macedonian soldiers did not like these changes. They had followed Alexander to the ends of the earth, but they did not want to bow to him like slaves. "I unite worlds," Alexander told them when they complained. "East and West, Greek and Persian, these differences mean nothing. We are all men under the same sky." Some understood what he was trying to do. Many did not, but all still followed him as he looked east again, toward lands no Greek had ever seen. "There are more worlds to conquer," he told them, "and our spear has only just begun its work." The men raised their weapons and cheered, but some of the older generals exchanged worried glances. How far would Alexander go? And what would happen to them all when he reached the edge of the world? Alexander led his army east, beyond the maps made by Greek travelers. They marched into lands where no Western man had ever stepped. The soldiers whispered among themselves, wondering what strange beasts or monsters they might find. The mountains of Bactria rose before them, their peaks lost in clouds. Snow covered the high passes even in summer. The cold bit through armor and froze beards. Men died not from enemy swords, but from the bitter wind that howled down from the heights. "This is not a place for men," muttered the soldiers. "This is where the gods hide from the world." Yet Alexander pushed on. His eyes were fixed on something beyond the horizon, something only he could see. In these far lands, Alexander faced a different kind of enemy. The people here did not fight in open battle. They struck from hiding, then melted back into the mountains. They poisoned wells and burned their own crops rather than let the invaders have them. For the first time, Alexander's men began to question their king. They had followed him across the known world. Was that not enough? "How far will we go?" they asked each other. "Does he mean to march until we fall off the edge of the world?" Worse than the grumbling was the shadow of betrayal that now followed Alexander. Philotas, son of his trusted general Parmenion, was accused of plotting against the king. Some said Philotas knew of a plan to kill Alexander and did nothing to stop it. Alexander ordered Philotas tortured until he confessed. Then he had him killed. But that was not the end. If the son was guilty, what of the father? Alexander sent men to kill old Parmenion, who had served him faithfully since the beginning. "The crown grows heavy," Alexander told Hephaestion one night as they sat alone in his tent. "I see daggers in every shadow." Hephaestion, who had been Alexander's closest friend since they were boys, put his hand on the king's shoulder. "Not every shadow hides a knife," he said, "and not every friend is an enemy waiting to be born." Alexander nodded, but his eyes remained troubled. The boy who had set out to conquer the world was gone. In his place sat a man who had seen too much blood and too many lands. At the Oxus River, Alexander did something strange. He took his spear, the same one he had thrown across the Hellespont at the start of his journey, and cast it into the deep waters. "Even the mightiest weapon must rest," he said as they watched it sink, "before it can conquer new worlds." His men did not understand, but they cheered anyway. They had learned to cheer even when their king's words made no sense. Beyond the mountains lay India, a land of wonders. Here lived men with skin dark as night. Here grew trees taller than any in Greece. Here flowed rivers wider than seas. And here waited kings who claimed to be gods, with armies riding on the backs of great beasts. At the Hydaspes River, Alexander faced King Porus, who commanded an army with elephants at its front. These creatures, as big as houses with tusks like spears, struck fear into the Macedonians who had never seen such monsters. "They are just beasts," Alexander told his frightened men, "and all beasts can bleed." The battle was the hardest Alexander had ever fought. The elephants crushed men under their feet. The Indian archers sent storms of arrows into the Macedonian lines. Even Alexander's famous phalanx, with its wall of spears, broke against the elephant charge. But Alexander had learned from every battle. He ordered his men to open paths for the elephants to run through, then attack them from the sides. He sent his fastest horsemen to ride around the Indian army and strike from behind. By sunset, the field belonged to Alexander. King Porus, wounded but still proud, was brought before him. "How do you wish to be treated?" Alexander asked the defeated king. Porus stood tall despite his wounds. "As befits a king," he answered. Alexander looked at the man for a long moment. Then he smiled. He saw in Porus something he recognized: pride, courage, the heart of a true king. "Then as a king you shall remain," Alexander declared. "Rule your lands in my name and be my friend rather than my enemy." This victory should have made Alexander happy. He had conquered yet another kingdom. But as he looked east, he saw more lands, more rivers, more mountains stretching into the distance. "There are more worlds beyond," he told his generals, pointing to the horizon. "We have only begun our journey." But this time his men did not cheer. They stood silent, their faces hard as stone. For 8 long years they had followed Alexander. They had marched from Greece to the edge of the world. They had bled for him, killed for him, watched their friends die for him. "No more," said Conus, the oldest of his generals. His beard had been black when they left Macedonia. Now it was white as snow. "We have given you our youth. Let us see our homes again before we give you our deaths." For the first time in his life, Alexander faced an enemy he could not defeat, the will of his own men. He raged at them. He locked himself in his tent for 3 days, refusing to eat or speak. But in the end, even Alexander the Great had to bend. "We turn west," he announced at last. "We go home." The men cheered, but Alexander did not smile. For him, turning back was a defeat worse than death. The spear that had pierced the world had finally found its limit, not in the strength of enemies, but in the endurance of friends. The journey home was harder than any battle Alexander had fought. The army marched through the Gedrosian desert, where the sun burned like a god's anger. Water was more precious than gold. Men died of thirst, their tongues black in their mouths. Others went mad from the heat, wandering away from the group to die alone in the sand. Alexander walked with his men rather than ride. If they suffered, he would suffer too. When they found a small pool of water, the soldiers brought a helmet full to their king. "There is barely enough for one man," they said. Alexander looked at the water, then at his thirsty army. Without a word, he poured the water into the sand. "If my men cannot drink," he said, "neither will I." The soldiers loved him for this. Even in their pain, they saw that Alexander was not just their king, but their brother. When they finally reached Babylon, the great city welcomed Alexander like a god returned from the heavens. The streets were covered with flower petals. People threw gold dust in the air. Children sang songs about the great king who had conquered the world. But in the midst of this joy, a heavy blow fell. Hephaestion, Alexander's dearest friend since childhood, fell sick with a fever. For 7 days, Alexander sat by his bed, giving him water, wiping his brow, praying to every god he knew. On the 7th day, Hephaestion died. Alexander's grief was like nothing anyone had ever seen. He cut his hair and lay across his friend's body, refusing to move. For a day and a night he stayed there, not eating, not drinking, as if he too wished to die. When they finally pulled him away, Alexander ordered the doctor who had failed to save Hephaestion to be killed. He commanded that the sacred fires in all temples be put out, something only done when a great king died. He planned a funeral that would cost more than most cities were worth. "Half of myself is gone," he told his remaining friends. "What use is an empire when the one who should share it walks in the Shadowland?" Something changed in Alexander after Hephaestion's death. The fire that had driven him across the world seemed to dim. He drank more wine than before. He had strange dreams that he would tell no one about. Sometimes he would stare at nothing for hours, as if seeing things no one else could see. Yet he still made plans. He wanted to conquer Arabia next, then sail west to Carthage and beyond. Perhaps he would circle the whole world and return to Greece from the west. No one had ever done such a thing. But then no one had ever done what Alexander had already done. In the summer heat of Babylon, Alexander held a great feast. Wine flowed like water. The king drank deeply, cup after cup, challenging others to match him. In the middle of the night, he suddenly cried out and grabbed his stomach. Pain like a spear had pierced him. They carried him to his bed. For 12 days, the fever burned through him. The best doctors in the empire tried everything they knew. Nothing helped. The fever only grew worse. Word spread through the city. People gathered outside the palace, praying to their different gods. Soldiers stood with their heads bowed, tears running into their beards. They had followed this man across the world. What would they do without him? Inside the palace, Alexander's generals gathered around his bed. Already they were thinking about what would happen next. Who would rule the vast empire Alexander had? Built? Would it stay as one piece or break apart? To whom do you leave your kingdom? They asked the dying king. Alexander, his voice barely a whisper, gave his final answer: to the strongest. With those words, he closed his eyes. The greatest conqueror the world had ever known, the man who had never lost a battle, was defeated, at last by an enemy he could not fight with sword or spear. Alexander was 32 years old. The news of his death spread across the world like fire through dry grass. In Greece, people wept in the streets. In Persia, some celebrated while others mourned the king who had treated them with respect. In Egypt, the priests declared him a god and promised he would live forever in the stars. His generals, who had been his friends, soon began to fight among themselves. The empire Alexander had built with blood and dreams broke apart like a dropped clay pot. Each man grabbed what he could hold. Ptolemy took Alexander's body to Egypt, where he built a great tomb of gold and crystal. People came from all lands to see the final resting place of the man who had changed the world. Years passed. Empires rose and fell. New conquerors came with their armies and dreams of glory, but none ever matched what Alexander had done. None ever went so far or changed so much in so short a time. The spear that had pierced the world was at rest, but its mark remained. In new cities that bore Alexander's name, in roads that connected lands once separate, in stories told around fires from Greece to India. Even today, more than 2,000 years later, we still tell the story of the golden-haired king who set out to conquer the world and nearly did. We still wonder what might have happened if he had lived longer. We still feel the point of that spear that changed the course of history. For though men die, legends endure. And no legend shines brighter than that of Alexander the Great, whose dreams were as vast as the sky, whose courage knew no fear, and whose vision saw a world united under one spear, one shield, one king. In the end, perhaps that is Alexander's true legacy, not the lands he won or the battles he fought, but the dream he gave to all who came after him. That one person, in one lifetime, might change the world forever.